I lost the love of my life on our wedding day and didn't see her again for 43 years. When I finally found her, what she told me changed everything I thought I knew about love, sacrifice, and the choices we make when we're young and foolish. Well, hello there, my dear viewers. Welcome back to my channel. For those of you who are new here, I'm Frank, and this is where I share stories from my 72 years on this beautiful, complicated planet of ours. Now, before I get into today's story, I need to ask you something that breaks this old heart of mine. I see the numbers every week, and would you believe that 96% of you wonderful people who watch these videos aren't subscribed to my channel? 96%. That's like having 100 friends over for dinner, and only 4 of them saying thank you. It makes me sadder than a dog in the rain. Truly it does. So if you're enjoying what you hear, would you do an old man a favor and hit that subscribe button? And while you're at it, give this video a like if it touches your heart, and leave me a comment. I read every single one, and they mean the world to me. Now let me tell you about Margaret. Sweet Margaret Sullivan. With her auburn hair that caught the sunlight like spun copper, and eyes the color of spring leaves. This story takes place back in 1973, when I was 28 years old, and working construction in a little town called Cedar Falls, Ohio. I thought I knew everything about love, about life, about what it meant to be a man. Lord, was I wrong? I met Margaret at Murphy's Diner on a Tuesday morning in March. I was sitting at the counter, nursing my coffee and reading the sports page, when she walked in, wearing a yellow sundress despite the cool spring air. She had this confidence about her, the way she carried herself, but when she smiled at old Murphy behind the counter, there was something almost fragile underneath. I couldn't take my eyes off her. She ordered coffee, black, and a slice of apple pie. When Murphy asked if she was new in town, she said she'd just moved here from Columbus to take a job at the elementary school, a teacher. I should have introduced myself right then, but I was tongue-tied like a schoolboy. Instead, I watched her eat her pie. Noticed how she read a paperback novel while she ate, how she thanked Murphy twice before leaving a $1 tip on a 60-cent check. I went back to Murphy's the next morning, and the next. By Friday, Margaret was laughing at my terrible jokes and letting me buy her coffee. By the end of the month, I was walking her home from school every day, carrying her stack of papers to grade. We'd sit on her front porch swing, talking about everything and nothing until the streetlights came on. Margaret had dreams, you see. Big dreams. She wanted to travel, to see Paris and Rome and all those places we'd only seen in picture books. She'd never been anywhere outside of Ohio, raised by her grandmother after her parents died in a car wreck when she was 12. But oh, how her eyes would light up when she talked about the Eiffel Tower or the canals of Venice. She had this way of describing places she'd never been, like she was remembering them, instead of imagining them. I was falling hard and fast. By summer, I was spending every free moment with her. We'd drive out to Miller's Pond on weekends, spread a blanket under the old oak tree, and she'd read to me from her favorite books while I sketched plans for the house I wanted to build for us someday. She loved Steinbeck and Hemingway, could quote whole passages from memory. I wasn't much of a reader myself, but I could listen to her voice for hours. It was on one of those perfect August afternoons that I proposed. I'd been carrying my grandmother's engagement ring around for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment. Margaret was reading to me from The Old Man and the Sea. When I just couldn't wait any longer, I got down on one knee right there on that old blanket and asked her to marry me. She said yes before I even finished asking. We were both crying and laughing, and she kept saying, "Yes, yes, of course, yes, you silly man." We set the date for October 15th, right there at Miller's Pond. She wanted a small ceremony, just our closest friends and family, followed by a reception at the town hall. The next 2 months were the happiest of my life. We found a little apartment above Henderson's hardware store, spent our evenings picking out curtains and planning our future. Margaret wanted 3 children, maybe 4. I wanted whatever made her happy. She talked about taking a honeymoon to New York City, seeing a real Broadway show. I started putting away every extra dollar I could. But then September came, and with it, a letter that changed everything. I came home from work on a Thursday to find Margaret sitting at our little kitchen table, crying. Not the gentle tears I'd seen when she was happy or touched by something beautiful. These were gut-wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. In her hands was a letter with official letterhead. Her brother David was alive. Now, I need to explain something here. Margaret's brother had been declared missing in action in Vietnam 3 years earlier. She'd grieved for him, had a memorial service, the whole thing. She wore a small silver bracelet with his name on it, never took it off. His death had been part of what made her so careful with her heart, so grateful for the love we'd found together. But the letter said he'd been found in a prisoner of war camp, badly injured but alive. He was being transferred to a military hospital in Germany, then eventually to Walter Reed in Washington, D.C. The letter was from some military official whose name I can't even remember now. But the important part was clear. David Sullivan was coming home, and he needed his family. Margaret was torn apart. Joy at having her brother back, guilt that she'd given up hope, and something else I didn't understand at first, fear. She kept reading the letter over and over, her hands shaking. That's when she told me about the promise. When David shipped out to Vietnam, Margaret had promised him something. If anything ever happened to him, if he was hurt or captured or needed her, she would drop everything and be there for him. Everything. She'd sworn it on their parents' grave, with her hand on her grandmother's Bible. David was all the family she had left in the world. Now, you might think this was just about visiting him, helping with his recovery. But it wasn't that simple. The letter explained that David's injuries were severe. He'd lost his left leg, had extensive nerve damage, and the doctors weren't sure about his psychological state after 3 years of captivity. He would need constant care, possibly for the rest of his life. Margaret felt called to be that caregiver. Not just felt called, she was convinced it was her duty, her sacred obligation to the promise she'd made, and to the brother who'd protected her their whole lives. But here's the thing that made it impossible. David was being discharged from the army with full disability benefits and medical support, but only if he remained in the Washington, D.C. area. There was a specialized treatment facility there, support groups, the whole infrastructure he'd need to rebuild his life. If Margaret was going to help him, really help him, she'd have to move there. Permanently. We fought about it, not angry fighting, but desperate, heartbroken discussions that went on for hours. I suggested we move the wedding, wait until David was stable, then bring him to Ohio to live with us. Margaret explained it wasn't that simple. The medical care he needed wasn't available in Cedar Falls. His entire support system would be in Washington. I offered to move there with her, leave my job, start over. But Margaret shook her head. She'd looked into it, done her research. The cost of living there was triple what we were used to. My construction skills might not transfer to that kind of market. We'd be struggling financially right when David needed the most stability and support. More than that, though, Margaret was afraid that if she brought me into this situation, if I sacrificed my life and career to help her care for her brother, I'd eventually resent it. Resent him. Resent her. She'd seen it happen to other couples who'd taken on family obligations. The love turned to resentment. The resentment turned to bitterness, and everyone ended up miserable. The wedding was 3 weeks away. We'd sent invitations, booked the hall, ordered the flowers. I kept thinking we'd figure out a solution, find some compromise that would let us be together and still honor her promise to David. But as the days passed, Margaret became more and more distant. She stopped talking about our honeymoon plans, stopped looking at the apartment we'd been fixing up. She'd sit for hours staring at that letter, twisting her engagement ring around her finger. 2 weeks before our wedding day, she made her decision. She came to the construction site where I was working, still wearing her yellow teaching dress but with mud on her shoes, from walking across the job site. I knew from her face what she was going to say before she opened her mouth. She couldn't marry me. She loved me more than she'd ever thought possible to love another human being. But she couldn't break the promise she'd made to David. She couldn't live with herself if she put her happiness above his needs, especially after what he'd sacrificed and suffered. But more than that, she couldn't ask me to give up my life, my home, my career, everything I'd worked for, to help her care for a brother I'd never even met. It wouldn't be fair to any of us. I begged her to reconsider, told her we could make it work, that love was stronger than any obstacle. I was young and stupid and convinced that if we just tried hard enough, wanted it badly enough, we could have everything. She took off my grandmother's ring and pressed it into my palm. Her hands were so cold they felt like ice. She told me she'd already given her notice at the school, already arranged to have her things shipped to Washington. She was leaving on Saturday morning, 2 days before what should have been our wedding. Then she kissed me one last time, and I tasted salt from both our tears. I didn't see her leave town. I couldn't bear to. Instead, I spent Saturday morning at Miller's Pond, sitting under our oak tree, throwing rocks into the water, and wondering how everything had fallen apart so fast. The guys from work had cancelled the bachelor party, my mother had called off the caterers, and everyone in town was looking at me with those pitying expressions that made me want to punch something. For months afterward, I'd catch myself looking for yellow dresses in crowds. Every auburn-haired woman made my heart skip, thinking for just a second that maybe Margaret had come back. I kept the engagement ring in my sock drawer for 2 years before finally returning it to my mother. I eventually married a wonderful woman named Susan, had 2 beautiful daughters, built a good life. But there was always a Margaret-shaped space in my heart that never quite filled in. Not because Susan wasn't enough. She was everything a man could ask for. But first love, real first love, it marks you permanently. Like a scar that never quite fades. Susan passed away 8 years ago. Cancer took her after a brave fight. We had 41 good years together, and I don't regret a single day of them. But after she was gone, After the grief had settled into something I could carry, I found myself thinking about Margaret more and more. Last year, my granddaughter Emily, she's good with computers, helped me search for Margaret on something called Facebook. It took us weeks of looking through Margaret Sullivan's and Margaret-other names, but we finally found her. Margaret Sullivan Porter, living in Arlington, Virginia. A retired teacher, widowed, with 2 grown sons and 4 grandchildren. Her profile picture showed the same green eyes, the same kind smile, though her auburn hair had gone silver like mine had gone gray. Emily helped me send her a message, just a simple one, saying that I was Frank Morrison from Cedar Falls, Ohio, and that I'd often wondered how her life had turned out. I hoped she was happy and healthy, and that maybe she'd remember the old oak tree at Miller's Pond. She wrote back the same day, said she'd thought about me often over the years, wondered if I'd had a good life, if I'd found love again. She was sorry to hear about Susan, said she sounded like a wonderful woman from what she'd read in my message. We started writing back and forth, just catching up at first. She told me about David, how he'd recovered better than anyone expected. He'd learned to use a prosthetic leg, became a counselor for other veterans, eventually married his physical therapist, and had 3 kids of his own. He'd passed away 5 years ago, finally succumbing to complications from his war injuries. But he'd lived a full, meaningful life. Margaret had married a State Department official named Robert Porter in 1978. He'd been understanding about her commitment to David, had helped support her brother's family through the years. They'd traveled the world together, all those places she'd dreamed about when we sat on her grandmother's porch swing. Paris, Rome, London, Tokyo. She'd seen everything she'd ever wanted to see. After months of messages, she asked if I'd like to meet for coffee. She was coming to Ohio to visit David's grave on the anniversary of his death, staying in Columbus for a few days. Would I be willing to drive up there? My hand shook as I typed yes. We met at a coffee shop near Ohio State University on a crisp October morning, almost exactly 43 years after our wedding day. That never happened. I got there early, nervous as a teenager on a first date, checking my appearance in every reflective surface. Then I saw her walking across the parking lot, and it was like time folded in on itself. She was 70 years old, with silver hair and laugh lines around her eyes, but she moved with the same grace she'd had at 27. She was wearing a yellow sweater. We sat and talked for 4 hours. About our children, our careers, the paths our lives had taken. She showed me pictures of her grandchildren. I showed her pictures of mine. We talked about Susan and Robert, how grateful we were to have found love again even after having our hearts broken. But mostly, we talked about that autumn in 1973, the decision that changed both our lives forever. That's when she told me something that shook me to my core. She said she'd lied to me about why she couldn't marry me. Oh, the letter about David was real, and her promise to him was real, and she really did move to Washington to help with his care. All of that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The real reason she couldn't marry me, the reason she'd been so afraid to bring me to Washington with her, was because she'd been offered something else along with the caregiving responsibility, a teaching position. Not just any teaching position, but a chance to work with children of military families, kids who'd lost parents in Vietnam, kids who were struggling with the same kind of trauma and loss that had shaped her own childhood. It was exactly the kind of work she'd always dreamed of doing, the way she could turn her own pain into purpose. But the job required a full commitment, extensive training, irregular hours, emotional intensity that would make it nearly impossible to maintain a marriage, especially to someone who'd already sacrificed so much to be there with her. She'd convinced herself that asking me to give up my life in Ohio, my job, my family, my whole world, just so she could pursue her dream career while caring for her brother, was the most selfish thing she could possibly do. So she'd focused on the David situation, made it sound like pure obligation and duty, because that seemed more noble than admitting she was choosing her career over our love. But here's the part that broke my heart all over again. She said she'd regretted that choice for 43 years. Not because her life had been bad, it had been wonderful in many ways, but because she'd never stopped wondering what our life together might have been like, whether we could have found a way to make it work, whether love really could have conquered all the obstacles we'd faced. She'd kept our engagement ring, still had it, after all these years, through her marriage to Robert, through moves and children and decades of life. She'd never been able to bring herself to get rid of it. We both cried then, sitting in that coffee shop like two old fools, grieving not just for what we'd lost, but for all the years we'd spent thinking the other one hadn't wanted to fight for what we had. I asked her the question that had haunted me for 4 decades. If she could go back, would she make the same choice? She looked at me with those green eyes that hadn't changed a bit and said, "No, I would have trusted you to love me enough to make it work. I would have trusted us." We spent the rest of that weekend together, walked around Columbus, visited the art museum, had dinner at a little Italian place where the waiter assumed we were married and celebrating our anniversary. We didn't correct him. On Sunday night, before she drove back to Virginia, we sat in my truck in the parking lot of her hotel and talked about what comes next. We're both in our 70s now, with children and grandchildren and complicated lives. She still lives near David's family, helps with his grandkids. I've got my daughters here in Ohio, my own responsibilities. But we've decided to see each other when we can. She's planning to come back at Christmas, and I'm going to visit her in Arlington in the spring. We're taking it slow, figuring out what it means to find each other again after so many years. I don't know if this is a second chance at the love story we never got to finish, or if it's just two old friends finding peace with the past. Maybe it's both. Maybe at our age, they're the same thing. What I do know is this: love doesn't follow the timeline you expect. Sometimes it waits 43 years to show you what you missed. Sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't losing someone you love. It's spending decades believing they chose to leave when really they were trying to protect you. Margaret and I lost half a lifetime together because we were too young and too proud and too scared to trust that love could survive anything. But maybe, just maybe, we've got enough life left to see what we can build with the wisdom that comes from surviving that kind of loss. So there you have it, my dear viewers. The love story that took 43 years to tell. If you've made it this far, if this old man's tale has touched your heart in some way, please remember to hit that like button and leave me a comment. Tell me about your own love stories. The ones that got away, the ones that came back, the ones that taught you something about the mysterious ways the heart works. And for heaven's sake, if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It really does make a difference to an old storyteller like me. Knowing that you're out there, listening to these memories, sharing in these moments, It makes all the difference in the world. Until next time, this is Frank, reminding you that it's never too late for love, and it's never too late to forgive yourself for the choices you made when you were young and thought you knew everything. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.